Welcome, students, to Module 6. This is going to be Chapter 12, Manifest Destiny, and Chapter 13, Sectional Crisis. So we're going to get right up to the Civil War. First one, Manifest Destiny. This is a painting, typically referred to as Manifest Destiny. It shows basically the progress of the U.S. going across the continent. You have this angelic figure who could be called Columbia, which was a sort of female personification of America, spreading civilization across the continent by way of telegraph. She's also holding a school book, and you can see a train and farmers and stagecoaches coming across the painting as we are expanding our civilization across the continent. And on the other side, on the left, you see darkness. You see Native Americans and wildlife down the bottom and buffalo at the top. And we will push them out as we bring in our civilization. And so that is what this painting represents. And it very much represents the way we have felt about Americans spreading across the continent pretty much through our entire history. So our first term is manifest destiny. The term itself, again, it really refers to this idea of the US is going to expand across the continent, and we typically refer to this as this desire to go from sea to shining sea. It's all about westward expansion. There's a big part of this that will come under some debate about the spread of slavery, which states should be slave states, which states should be free states. Obviously, we have to deal with the Native Americans, which are going to be which already live there because it's not an undeveloped, uncivilized continent. There are, of course, hundreds of thousands of people living there. Additionally, we don't control everything. When we last left off, we had control of the area in red on the map, and we had control of the Louisiana Purchase. Eventually, we will get Florida in 1821. We will also get Oregon territory a little bit later, and we will annex Texas, which will eventually lead to the Mexican-American War, which leads to the Mexican cessation and the Gadsden Purchase, which leads to our current the continental borders of the U.S. Alaska, Hawaii will come in later. Oh, the most important thing to remember with Manifest Destiny is this idea of our country expanding from sea to signing sea. Now, going back to Florida specifically, we briefly mentioned before that it was controlled by the Spanish, and then it was a big thorn in the side of Americans because Native Americans, like the group known as the Seminoles, lived in Florida, and sometimes they raided into the United States. But more than anything, Florida was a threat to the United States. In fact, in terms of Southern slave states, because it was this beacon of freedom where the escaped slaves could get to. Florida had sort of served as this thorn in the side of the U.S., a class and racially divided country, especially across the South. And it's right next to it, you have this basically free haven for Native Americans that had been kicked out of kicked out of Eastern United States at this point, and African slaves. Both of them had a great deal more freedom because the Spanish did not have a lot of control over Florida. You also had the British, especially early on, basically giving stuff to the Native Americans and helping them to sort of become an irritant to the United States, which we were still kind of rivals with. And one of these places that developed in Florida was what's known as the Negro Fort. This was an old abandoned fort left behind by the Spanish. It had been taken over by runaway slaves. and created a mixed free Black and Native American community about 60 miles south of the Georgian border. It had an estimated 1,000 people living there. And again, it was this haven for runaway slaves. Now, this haven was seen basically as a giant threat to especially Georgia. And there was a worry, especially after some of these slave revolts that have happened and attempted slave revolts, that they could represent a threat. They might come over here and free, some slaves or try to convince them to run away to Florida. And so eventually the people of Georgia will convince the government to intervene and invade Florida. Basically, the United States has decided that they are going to take matters into their own hands to control Florida and bring it to heel. And so they will send in American force to basically take down the fort. And they are specifically targeting this free fort. And by the time they get to this fort in Florida, most of the people living there have run away and gone further south. But about 300 of the residents living around the fort, living in this free community, have held up in the fort and basically refused to leave. And eventually, American force decides to attack the fort. The American force will fire on the fort, and they basically get a lucky shot and hit the munitions that are kept in the fort and blow the whole thing up, killing pretty much all the people inside, 300 men, women, and children, leaving only a few survivors. Massacre of the Free Black Fort will only be the beginning of a series of conflicts with one Native American tribe known as the Seminole. These will be a group of Native Americans living in Spanish-controlled Florida, mostly in the northern and peninsula area of Florida. After the massacre of the Free Black Fort, you have Andrew Jackson leading a force into Florida to push the Seminoles out of that area completely in order to destroy not only the area that was seen as a safe haven for runaway slaves, but also to sort of get rid of anybody else they considered sort of malcontents or bad in that area. And that will be the First Seminole War. So the first one is because they're giving shelter to runaway slaves. Eventually, that will lead to the Adams-Onis Treaty, where Spain will give us Florida. Then we're going to have another Seminole War in the 1830s when we basically tell the Seminoles, hey, um, Andrew Jackson, the guy who killed you, killed a bunch of your people and kicked you out earlier. Well, he's president now, and he says you need to move to Oklahoma. And some of them go, others resist. And this will start the Second Seminole War. Not all of them leave. Some of them will end up staying, leading to another conflict a little bit down the road, and that'll be the Third Seminole War. Ultimately, it is one of the longest and most expensive series of the Indian Wars that take place in our history. It will expand all the way from 1816 until the 1830s and 1840s. Next one, we have the Comanche. This is another group of natives. The Comanche had very quickly adapted to the horse, which came over from the Europeans, and they had become a hunting and pastoral society. They were nomadic. They traveled in the teepees, which you see pictured in the bottom corner. And they primarily lived by moving around this huge section of the Central Great Plains, stretching down into modern day Texas, across Oklahoma and Colorado and sort of that area. They were so powerful, they also kind of controlled everything going through their territory. If you were going to be traveling, if you were going to be going through that area, it would probably be a good idea to pay off the Comanche and trade with them in order to avoid anything bad happening to you. They were not very fond of the Mexicans at the time, which had just gotten their independence from Spain, especially in what's time was Tejas, one of the far off Spanish settlements. Of course, at this time, Tejas was very, very sparsely populated, less than about 4,000 Tejanos living here at the time, which made it very easy for the Comanche to control and very difficult for the Mexican government to expand their control into Texas. So they just sort of ran that northern portion and did whatever they want, and they will remain incredibly powerful even after the U.S. takes Texas and expands into their territory. It will be towards the end of the century, and they will remain quite powerful until the end of the century, which we'll talk about in 1302. The primary source of food was the buffalo, was also a source of their tools, and the hides were used to create their shelters and many other resources they had. As previously stated, Texas was still part of Mexico at this time, known as Tejas. It was part of the state of Coahuila y Tejas. And it had been very sparsely populated. There were not a lot of people living there. And so, one of the ways that Mexico thought, again, Texas had been very sparsely populated since Mexico had broken away from Spain in 1821. And before that, the Spanish had actually invaded the first. If you've taken Texas history, if you grew up in Texas, Stephen F. Austin and his father, Moises Austin, will negotiate an agreement with Spain after Mexico gets its independence. His son, Stephen F. Austin, will renegotiate it with Mexico. Mexico basically says, yes, you can come and, come to America, come to our country, Americans, we need you. Can you set up and populate Texas and try to form a border? Because they were, again, the Comanches were relatively, I wouldn't say fond of the Anglos, but they treated them better than they treated the Mexicans at the time, probably because of their history with the Spanish, which was not great. They only had a couple of rules. No slaves. You had to convert to Catholicism, and you had to speak Spanish. That was not something that sat very well with the Anglo settlers. Many of them will refuse to convert. They will convert only, nominally, and then still practice their Protestant ways. They will also not really learn Spanish that well. And many of them will also sneak in slaves. And you also have another huge problem where you have a bunch of illegal immigrants coming into Mexico from America, these early Texas settlers, without doing what they're supposed to. And then Mexico kind of comes in and goes, "Hey, hey, hey, y'all need to stop this. We had these agreements and all these other things, and you need to agree by them." And this is when the people of Texas stand up and say, "Actually, no, we don't like your rule and we want to break free." This is in 1835, and you have the start of what's known as the Texas Revolution, or at the time it was called the Texian Revolution. People like Stephen F. Austin, Sam Houston, Lamar, Davy Crockett, Jim Bowie, William Travis will fight. Again, there's a whole lot of Americans coming into Texas to join this fight. You have several famous battles. You have the Battle of Gonzales, the Battle of Goliad. Obviously, the most if you know anything about Texas, if you've grown up in Texas, the most famous battle is, of course, the Battle of the Alamo, which we lost quite terribly. 200 or so defenders holding out against 2,000 Mexican attackers under the president of the time, Santa Anna. William Travis, Jim Bowie, and Davy Crockett will all die in that battle. Another one of the 200 defenders that dies is a man named Robert Ballantyne. He was actually one of my ancestors. So one of my ancestors who died in the Alamo, they came over from Scotland, and he will go to the Alamo to help out the Texas Revolution and sacrifice his life. And that will lead to the rallying cry of the Texas Revolution, which is "Remember the Alamo," which leads them to their victory at San Jacinto, which is pictured at the top painting. While there, Santa Anna is captured along with many of his army. He is attempting to blend in. He doesn't want them to know who he is, but they do. The story goes that one of his people, what basically one of his soldiers recognized him and, saluted the president as he's supposed to. And they go, "Oh, okay, well, let's negotiate a treaty." One problem. Under international law, you cannot sign a treaty under duress. So basically, the Texian army told Santa Anna, you don't sign this, we're going to kill you. And so that makes it not legally binding. So for a time, Texas sort of sits in this limbo where people of Texas are calling themselves the Republic of Texas. It is an independent country from Mexico. They have this treaty signed by Santa Anna, even though it was under duress, so it's not legally binding. The next year after the is over, you do get the Republic of Texas recognized by Jackson. One of the ways that you can sort of become your own country if you are an area in rebellion is to get recognized by other sovereign countries. The United States will give Texas a big boost by doing that. You also have our first president, Sam Houston, who will be a heavy advocate for annexation by the United States, but there's still a little bit of a we're not sure about that. His vice president was a man named Mirabeau Lamar. He was not in favor of annexation. He wanted Texas to become his own. He actually wanted Texas to take over the rest of Mexico in the northern part that will eventually become states like Arizona and California. And during this time, Texas will have a little bit of a trouble. There's the problem with the Comanche that we have issues with. Our slave economy, we also have a very heavy based slave economy, which a lot of the countries in the world are beginning to move away from. So we're not very happy to negotiate with Texas. We also take on a lot of debt. We were really struggling on our own. And you had a lot of infighting between the nationalists and the pro-annexationists of Lamar and Sam Houston. There's this big fight about where should the capital be? Should it be in the newly found city of Austin or should it be in the coastal city of Houston? And it's just we were not doing well on our own. But eventually, as we mentioned before, President Tyler in March of 1845, right before he leaves office, will basically approve the annexation of Texas, and they will agree to the annexation and become a state on February 19th, 1846. However, there's a problem. Texas believes that the border of Texas is the Rio Grande and extends all the way up into modern day Colorado, which is the area in the map which has the stripes. There's just one problem with this annexation. There's a disagreement between Texas, Mexico, and the United States about what is the border of Texas. Historically, according to Mexico, Texas has only ever been up to the Nueces River, which is around Goliad, San Antonio area, the area that is circled on the map. Texas, however, claims that the border of Texas is the Rio Grande, which is our modern border with Mexico today. And so there's this area in between that is disputed. And it is that dispute that will lead to the eventual Mexican-American War. Basically, since Mexico did not recognize Texas as an independent country, Texas was still considered part of its territory. There was still that disputed area between the Nueces and the Rio Grande. And they did not recognize the US's control over Texas. But the president at the time, President Polk, will basically decide to force the issue. He's very big into annexing California. California had begun to really grow and become important as well. And so he really wanted to buy California from Mexico. Mexico said no. So he's like, okay, well, we'll do this hard way. So he sends a force into this disputed area. They run into a Mexican army who sees them and thinks they're an invading army. They fire on each other. And then he uses this as an excuse to go to war. The war does not take very long. Unfortunately, Mexico is been suffering. They've had a couple of revolutions and things in between over the last several decades. They've not been very stable since they broke away from Spain. And American forces are able to quickly overwhelm, basically take California. They're able to land at the port of Veracruz and occupy the capital city of Mexico City on September 1847. We will also invade and attack Alta California. And the fighting is over in about a year and a half. Most of it because of the amount of time it takes to move troops around in this time period. We're still moving by horse and by slow sailboat. The treaty that will end the war is known as the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. It is signed in February of 1848. Mexico will give up 55% of its territory, which is the modern day states of Nevada, California, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and of course that, the current border of Texas. We will also basically pay them a bunch of money, about $15 million, and take on some of their debt. There will also eventually be what's known as the Gadsden Purchase, which gives us our current border of Mexico and Arizona, because there was some issue with what the border was actually was. And actually, we want this border because we want to build a train here a few years later. This is what's known as the Mexican Secession. So that is that entire area in orange there. And it will be quite a huge problem between Mexico and the US. And we will not be on good terms until the mid 20th century. Although you could argue that America has not always viewed its neighbor with very nicely or very well. And then after we get California, something amazing happens. We find a bunch of gold. Um, right before the treaty is signed, we find gold in California. And January of 1848, this leads to a massive amount of people moving to California, looking for gold, looking to strike it rich. This leads to a lot of problems with the native Californios living there. The Native Americans who are also living there will be very quickly removed out of their territory. Many of them will also die from disease. And California will become a state in less than 2 years. And what's known as the Compromise of 1850, which will bring California in as a state because of the massive amount of people moving there. Of course, when you have a bunch of people moving to a certain area, these settler groups, it's not great. They will push out a lot of people and kill a lot of Native Americans. This group of people, the largest chunk of them will move in 1849, which is where we get the nickname 49ers, the ones who moved there to strike it rich on the gold rush, and will help basically take control of California for the US. And now they have a football team named after them. Now we get into chapter 13, which is the sectional crisis. So this is basically the things that lead up to the Civil War, where America splits over ideas of slavery and its future. And one of the most interesting parts of this, and one of the probably the most surprising to me growing up, was this idea that two people in Congress actually came to blows. It's only happened really twice in our history. Once in the very beginning, um, not the very beginning. The division of our country went all the way to the top, including this picture here, which is a drawing of the fight that happens in Congress when a pro-slavery person attacks an anti-slavery person who's in the middle of giving a speech, which shows how divided the country was at the time, even in the halls of Congress, which are supposed to be a place where we meet and discuss peacefully solutions to our problems. Our first term is Frederick Douglass. I mentioned him briefly with the Seneca Falls Convention. He was an abolitionist, someone who fought for the abolition of slavery. Douglass was actually born into slavery in Maryland, which is one of the border states between the North and the South. We talked about Maryland very early on as a place where tobacco was grown. They've had slaves pretty much since the beginning. Maryland was one of those states where a slave was not allowed to learn how to read and write, but Douglas had shown an incredible ability and thirst for knowledge from a very young age. And so his mistress, the female, the wife of his owner, decided to teach him how to read and write, even though it was against the law. And he will use his knowledge and skills to basically escape slavery by fleeing to New York at the age of 19 in 1837. And he will become an incredibly well-known speaker and advocate for abolition. He will publish the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass in 1845. The main point of this is to basically show that people doubted that he was a slave. People doubt, like, you're too well read, you're too intelligent, you're too smart. How could you have been a slave? Like, well, here's my story. This is what I went through when I grew up. This is everything that I've been through. And it's again just sort of that proof that, just because you have an entire slave caste, you have an entire population kept low, does not mean that they are not capable of great things or they're not capable of more. And he will become a lifelong advocate for enslaved people and the rights of the disenfranchised. We mentioned how he was at the Seneca Falls Convention. He was a skilled orator, which is a speaker and a writer, and fought for abolitionists. And he advised the president. And again, he will push for emancipation. And at the time, he's going to be the most well-known African American in America. And one of his more famous speeches, he will ask, "What is the 4th of July to a slave?" Which is one of the documents you're going to be reading in the primary sources. And he asks, "What is the 4th of July to a slave? Why would a slave want to celebrate this holiday that's about freedom and equality and democracy when they don't see any benefit from it, when they don't get to that freedom, when they don't get that equality?" So he was, again, a very important and very influential abolitionist at the time and voice against slavery. Our next term, the Wilmot Proviso. Again, this deals with this area that we have taken from Mexico, which is the Mexican cessation. Wilmot was a member of the House of Representatives, and he will issue this and basically starts this big debate in Congress about whether or not we should ban slavery expanding into the new territory so that we have taken from Mexico. And it is very popular in the North, which is against slavery, but the anti-slave territory. But at the same time, it is very unpopular in the slave South because they want more slave states. They want to maintain the equal measure of slave states and free states, and they want more slaves. They want more territory to be open to slaves. And so it will pass in the House, which was going to have a much more representation of the North, because the North is going to have a larger population that is able to vote and is able to participate versus the South, where because of the equality kept in the Senate between the number of slave states and the number of non-slave states, they are able to kill anything that might take down slavery. So this is just another example of sort of the division and how slavery leads to conflict and nothing really getting done because they can't agree. And then our next one, the Compromise of 1850, mentioned this at the end of the last chapter, where we're talking about California becoming a state. This is one of the last things done by Henry Clay, the great compromiser. It's meant to maintain the balance between slave states and free states. Again, it is basically every time we've got to add a state, there's this huge fight and this huge problem about whether or not we're going to decide whether which states are going to be entered, who's going to be a slave state, what's not going to be a slave state. And so the idea is that California is entering as a free state. It has a lot of population thanks to the gold rush. And Henry Clay is going to begin this, but he's getting kind of old now and running out of steam. And so he will eventually hand over negotiations to Stephen Douglas, a Northern senator who is a supporter of slavery despite coming from a non-slave state. In the deal, basically, Texas gives up everything north of the line from Missouri Compromise, which gives us the shape of Texas the way it is today, that northern panhandle, which also gives Oklahoma its panhandle. We will also take on all of the Republic of Texas's debt that they have built up while being an independent country. And then that will mean that you have another slave state, which is Texas, and you have California. So again, everything is kept equal. And we have also maintained the old ideas about no slave states above this particular line. But taking on Texas debt is not enough. And so the slave states needed one more piece of law. They needed one more thing so that they decided to go ahead and support, um, in order for them to support California becoming a state. And so they will request what's known as the Fugitive Slave Act. Basically, slaves are running away to the north where slavery is illegal. And so we basically want the help of the northern governments to get them back. And this is something that is a hugely controversial thing because it will also entail a number of losses of freedom, including the right to trial by jury, which is in the Bill of Rights. It will basically say if you are accused of being a slave who has run away, you do not have that right. You can be imprisoned as long as we need to imprison you if you are accused of being a slave, which violates what's known as habeas corpus, which is this idea that you can only be you can only be basically in jail for so long without being charged for a crime. It also basically made not only the people of the government, but also the people of the North financially and legally responsible for catching and of apprehending runaway slaves. If you were found to be helping these escaped slaves, you could be put in prison for 6 months and given $1,000 fine, which is an absolutely insane amount of money for the time. And this is incredibly controversial in the North. The fine is about $40,000 in today's money. And again, people who would be against this were now basically legally required to hunt down and turn in freed slaves. Even more so, the government officials in charge of sending those slaves back home received a bonus of $10, which is like $300 today's money. Basically, any person who is accused of being a slave, if you determine they are a fugitive and send it back, you get a bonus, which is a huge conflict of interest and is going to lead to a lot of problems. And not surprisingly, there are going to be a number of free blacks that are sent to the South against it. One of the most famous stories of this becomes what's known as the 12 Years a Slave, which is a movie and a book all about how this free black man was accused of being a slave and sent to the South and lived well for 12 years as a slave. And it was one of those things that really deepened the divide and the hatred between the North and the South. Again, the North was being seen as forced into supporting Southern slavery, even though it was illegal there. Our next term is the Underground Railroad, which was organized by abolitionists across the United States, especially in the North, to help people escape slavery. It will go on from about the 1780s all the way up until the end of the Civil War. Originally, the focus of the Underground Railroad was to get slaves to the North, where slavery was illegal. But after the Fugitive Slave Act and other laws, it was also extended to help them get to Canada, where slavery had been abolished outright. These were usually freedom seekers, escaped slaves. They had to travel hundreds of miles to reach freedom. And along the way, they would constantly be chased by slave catchers and government officials working to capture them. Not to mention roving gangs of of just people looking for slaves, police forces, deputized people. Like, I mean, it was a lot of people across the South. The and then thanks to the Fugitive Slave Act, even in the North, there'd be roving bands of slave catchers trying to catch as many to send them back down to the South. You also had some Northern officials who helped runaway slaves and abolitionists who provided shelter and supplies. So even though these people escaping slavery will face a great deal of turmoil and a great deal of obstacles to freedom, there are some really amazing people who put their lives in the line to help them. The most famous, of course, is Harriet Tubman. She was the most well-known conductor on the Underground Railroad. They used a lot of railroad and train style language. So if you were somebody who guided people, you were a conductor. There was tickets and things like that. She is the most well-known conductor. She will end up saving about 70 enslaved people and guiding them to freedom. After the Civil War started, she will turn into a Union spy and help spy for the Union. Was quite good for that. And then after the war is over, she will advocate for women's rights, women's right to vote. The Underground Railroad, about 100,000 slaves will escape by 1850, but by the time the Civil War breaks out, about 500,000 slaves will escape by the end of the Civil War. Is basically when the war breaks out, a lot of them will just simply run to Union lines, which we'll talk about later. And the Union really didn't know what to do with them, but at least there they had escaped their slave masters. Our next term is Uncle Tom's Cabin. This is a book, an anti-slavery novel released in 1852. It was the second best-selling book next to the Bible in the 1850s. It was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. The story of Uncle Tom is basically taken from the narratives of escaped slaves she interviewed and talked to and looked over, even Frederick Douglass's story to help create the story. And the idea is to try to make you feel sentimental, to try to make you feel bad for the slaves. And it certainly does that. It certainly personifies the slave. It's an unfortunate fact in humans that if we just have these nebulous stories, that it's hard for us to identify with somebody who's different from our own. or who's experienced something we never have. So the goal of Harriet Beecher Stowe was to try to personify a slave and try to tell the story of this slave known as Uncle Tom. And in the book, you're supposed to basically feel sorry for him because he's been a good slave and he's worked for this family and been loyal to them for his whole life. And, now he's, suffering a tragic death and all this stuff. And it's again, it's supposed to appeal to your emotions and at the same time make you feel bad for the slaves, but it will also reinforce many racist stereotypes. As far as the author, eventually she will meet President Lincoln, and he will refer to her as the little lady that wrote the book that started this great war because the popularity of the book will help inspire a lot of anti-slavery feelings. And also, with the rise of that anti-slavery, you have a lot of people in the South who are like, "Oh no, they want to get rid of slavery," and we're willing to break up the country for it because of it. Next term, the Lincoln Douglas debates. This is a debate between incumbent senator from Illinois, Stephen Douglas. We talked about him earlier as the guy who finished the Compromise of 1850 after Henry Clay bowed out. He has been a senator since 1847 from the northern state of Illinois. He is a Democrat. He is pro slavery, and even though he is in the North where slavery is illegal, he also believes in this idea, what he calls popular sovereignty. And so, with the Compromise of 1850, and on top of everything, on top of the Fugitive Slave Act, on top of taking all of Texas's debt, and all this other stuff that they had done to appease the slave states, it also undid the Missouri Compromise, which said you can't have any slaves above this line, and said that instead you should be able to vote on whether or not you're going to have slaves. And so that will cause a huge problem when it comes to the settling of Kansas and Nebraska, which we'll talk about in a moment. And he will have a challenger in the 1858 Illinois Senate race, a young Republican, named Abraham Lincoln. Republicans at this point was a brand new party. They had the Whig Party had disintegrated, and now you had a new party. They disintegrated over this over the slavery debate, and because they hadn't really been able to find a base, and now you have a new party, and you have Abraham Lincoln, a young lawyer, who goes up against this incredibly well-known, important senator. The debate heavily focused on the issue of slavery, and they will basically travel all around the state of Illinois doing these debates, and they will attract a large crowd thanks to the invention of the telegraph and the railroad. You have people traveling from all around to try and visit these debates. The actual transcripts of the debates will go out over telegraph and be spread all around. And of course, Lincoln is going to be fighting against slavery, while Stephen Douglas is in favor of slavery. And so it becomes a sensationalized thing, and Lincoln becomes an already popular person. But at the time, senators are not elected like they are today. They were decided by the state legislature. And since the legislature was also Democratic majority, Lincoln did not win, and Stephen Douglas won re-election. But this will again catapult Lincoln to a higher level, and he will in turn take all the transcripts of the debates and publish them and become basically even more popular because of this, and that will set up his eventual run for president. Going back to what we mentioned before, this idea of popular sovereignty, this idea that laws and government are created and the subject to the will of the people. This was used this was used to override the Missouri Compromise and expand with the Kansas-Nebraska Act to allow the people to decide, which was supported by Stephen Douglas. This will be the collapse of the Whig Party. leading to basically, once again, we only have one party, the Democratic Party. President Buchanan will win election in 1856. He is another in a series of these not very effective or very useful presidents. Again, the idea of a president is a little different back then. They don't really have a lot to do, and they don't travel around the country. There's not a lot of popular support. And at the same time, his opponent is a Republican from this newly created party that comes out of the Whigs, and he easily wins the election, but basically does nothing to do anything. The old president, Franklin Pierce, is unpopular. And this is one of those time periods in history where you have several one term presidents, basically because of Tyler was unpopular, and then Pierce was unpopular. Like you had just said, basically since Jackson, you'd only had one-term presidents. You didn't have anybody who was really very popular and popular enough to win re-election. And Buchanan will continue that. He is unpopular. He does not win re-election, and during his presidency, the country will pull itself apart over the issue of slavery, and he does nothing to stop it. He's, in my personal opinion, probably one of the worst presidents we've ever had. Um, and he will actively do nothing while states begin to secede from the Union after the 1860 election. Again, going back to what we mentioned before, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, once again, you have these territories, Kansas and Nebraska, that are trying to become states. And we have decided that we are going to let them decide whether they're going to have slaves or not. And this leads to a lot of problems because both sides want them to be either free or slave. And so you have this massive influx of people. And when you have a bunch of people moving into an area that don't agree, there's going to be a little bit of a problem. This is what's typically referred to as the prelude to the Civil War, also known as Bleeding Kansas. From basically from the moment this act is passed, you have an influx of people moving into Kansas to try to create a state government and apply for to create a state government and apply for statehood, while at the same time trying to outnumber the other side. And so you have anti-slave people moving in, you have pro-slave people from you even have pro-slave people from Missouri going into Kansas to vote illegally for this constitution. And their first attempt to become a state fails. It again because of these people crossing and voting in illegally. It breaks out into fighting, and one of the early leaders is a man named John Brown, pictured there. He will take up arms and try to fight against these pro-slavery settlers, and you have about 200 people who are killed or wounded in various battles between pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups. And it becomes basically like this mini civil war. But ultimately, it is not settled even before the Civil War starts, and Kansas will eventually enter as a free state in 1861 after the Civil War has already started. At the same time, when people are moving to Kansas and shooting each other over slaves, you have a fight break out in Congress, which is what I mentioned at the very beginning. You have a pro-abolitionist Republican from Massachusetts named Charles Sumner. He went before Congress, as you do, and began talking about his act. He talked about how bad slavery is and speaking out against the violence in Kansas. And while doing so, he mentions basically this other senator, Senator Butler, who is a pro-slavery and slave-owning Democrat. And in the middle of his speech, this cousin of that senator gets up and starts beating Charles Sumner with his cane and nearly beats him to death on the congressional floor before he stopped. And this is seen as the breakdown of reasoned discourse. Again, Congress is where we're supposed to meet and solve these problems and come to some sort of compromise to solve these problems so it doesn't break out to violence. So there isn't civil war, so there isn't any of these problems. And this shows that even in the most sacred halls of our country, that's not happening. So it makes the polarization of slavery even worse. And again, now you have fighting in Kansas, you have fighting in Congress. And Sumner will recover and become a martyr for the cause. Again, showing the brutality, the breakdown of Southern chivalry. Like the Southern people view themselves as so honorable and everything else. And but oh well, then why are you, beating people who disagree with you? As I've mentioned a couple times, the Whig Party is no more. They had only a couple decades before they collapsed. And a lot of this is because they were kind of spread out across the country and they were not all in agreement over the issue of slavery. And so ultimately, the party will tear itself apart in 1854. And so, in response, members of the Whig Party, but also anti-slavery activists and industrial leaders in the North, will come together to create the Republican Party, and they will form the primary opposition to the Democratic Party, although it will take them a couple elections to really get a foothold. They will not be able to really get a lot of candidates in the 1854 election, nor in 1856, or even 1858. But it's in 1860 that they really get a good part of the government, including the presidency. And their main thing is to stop the expansion of slavery. They're not trying to get rid of slavery, but they did say that slavery was a moral evil. And that was enough for the South and for supporters of slavery to be against them and to see them as a threat to the institution of slavery altogether. During the decade leading up to the Civil War, you also have another major event that happens. This is known as the Dred Scott decision. This is a Supreme Court case decided in 1857. Basically, the slave is taken out of the slave South and taken into the North. And in 1857, he will argue that he and his wife and his two daughters are free because they had been taken to a free state where slavery is no longer allowed. And so it will go all the way up to the Supreme Court. And there, the Supreme Court will actually side not only against Dred Scott, but will go way beyond this case. Instead of just saying, no, actually, you're still a slave, they've actually will strike down the Missouri Compromise, which limits slavery above the bottom portion of the Missouri Compromise, and they will also declare that people of African descent are not included as a citizen in the Constitution, which basically says if you're black, then you have no rights. Then you are not protected by any of the amendments. You are not protected by the Constitution. The Constitution is only for white people. It only protects white people and their citizenship and their rights. And if you are of African descent, then you're not a citizen. You can never be a citizen. And of course, there are thousands of black citizens living in the North, which have been free blacks for our entire history. There's been black people who voted in elections in the North. But now this decision completely erases all of that, and then it's considered the worst Supreme Court decision in history by most. It is absolutely decried in the North, while of course in the South they're like, "Yay!" This reinforces slavery. And Scott, the owner, felt so bad about the decision, he will actually release him the next year. Although, unfortunately, he will die about a year later, so he will only get to enjoy his freedom for some time. But it is one of the things that really helps ratchet up tensions between the North and the South because, again, you have the North, which has a larger population, a larger economy, and and their wishes and their laws and their ideals are being overridden by the South, which, despite having a much smaller population that is able to vote and participate in democracy, they are having a much greater control over the government. And they're having all these pro-slavery laws and pro-slavery decisions enforced upon them, even though they are against slavery. And so this will only increase tensions even more. And when the anti-slavery people are really yelling out and making a ruckus, it also makes the pro-slavery people really afraid because then they're like, oh no, they're going to try to take our slaves away. And it just makes everything a whole lot worse. Now, one of the anti-slavery people who will really put everything on the line, unlike any other people during this time, is a man named John Brown. We mentioned him briefly during Bleeding Kansas. He will be an abolitionist leader. During that time, he will use both his ideas, will use his position as a preacher and as a Christian, as a radical, to lead the anti-slavery fights in Kansas. He was an evangelical Christian. He grew up Puritan and was one of these that really, really believed not only that slavery was wrong, but we should actually fight against it and be willing to um, do whatever we could to take it down. He saw himself as an instrument of God, and he believed that his purpose was to strike a death blow to slavery. And he will be one of those people that does do, everything he can. And he will first, he will fight in Kansas against pro-slavery people. He will be involved in several raids and involves of death of several slavery supporters, including five supporters at the Potawatomi Massacre. He'll also bring his sons into these things, who will fight and be part of his anti-slavery forces. Small groups, but again, on the opposite side, you have pro-slavery groups that are also killing people and attacking people, and so they are not only defending themselves but also carrying out this violence as well. And he will lead about three battles, be involved in three different battles in Kansas. People like William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass did not like his tactics. They thought he was too radical and too out there. And he really will go above and beyond. In October 1859, just a little before the start of the war, he will lead a raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which is in attack an armory there. Again, an armory is a place where they keep all the weapons for militias and for armies and things like that. And he took his sons and some other supporters and a couple of slaves, freed slaves, and spread the word and basically said, "We are going to go free your fellow slave people. We're going to go free their fellow Africans." And they will get into the armory, but ultimately they do not survive. His sons are killed in the attack, along with most of his other supporters. He is captured and survives. And of course, he is going to be arrested, put on trial, and executed for treason because he is taking up arms against the United States, and that is not allowed. And so, for some people, he is a madman and a terrorist, but other people see him as a martyr. In fact, Union soldiers will actually march to um, march to a song called "John Brown's Body," which basically because they see him as somebody who is willing to fight and die and risk everything, which he did for the anti-slavery cause. And you will read a primary source. One of the primary sources you will read will be about somebody's reaction to two different, very different people's reaction to John Brown. One person who is basically like, how could you, support John Brown? How could you believe in him? How could you? And the other is very much like, well, he's human and he did what he believed. Who wanted to visit John Brown from a woman who wanted to visit John Brown before he was executed. So we've got violence in Kansas, we've got violence in Congress, and we've got all these problems. You've got all these laws and terrible decisions. The country is tearing itself apart. And so now we have an election. James Buchanan is incredibly unpopular, and he is not selected to run again. Instead, the Democrats will nominate Stephen Douglas, who is pro-slavery, but he's apparently not pro-slavery enough. And so the Democratic Party will split and nominate a second president. They'll have basically Southern Democrats versus Northern Democrats. And the Southern Democrats will nominate the vice president, the John C. Breckinridge, and Buchanan will support his run. Republicans will nominate Abraham Lincoln. Again, he's the anti-slavery one guy we talked about earlier. He was also in a big popular national figure for arguing against slavery in the Stephen Douglas debates. And then you have another man named John Bell, who is from the Constitutional Union Party, who is very popular in kind of the border states, the states that have slavery but don't really consider themselves part of the Southern slave states. And they're again more focused on let's keep the union together. We shouldn't break up over slavery. And the Southern Democrats, especially, were very, very, very afraid that Lincoln was going to ban slavery. And I mean, he did talk about the Republican Party talked about how slavery was a moral evil and they wanted to stop it expanding, but did not mention that it would, they wanted to get rid of slavery where it was, but it still wasn't enough. And because the Democrats had split their votes, it meant that Lincoln was going to win. So Lincoln only gets 39% of the vote. So he doesn't even win a majority. He wins what's known as a plurality. And it's all the northern states except for Missouri and a couple and split votes in New Jersey as well. Breckinridge gets the second most in terms of electoral votes, but actually the third most in terms of overall vote. He just wins the entire South. But as you can see, even though, yes, it's a significant portion of the map, look at the election totals, like look at the vote totals. Those are the population of Texas is only worth 4 electoral votes. You start off with 3 automatically. So Texas is still very much not very populated. And so the most populous state in the South that voted for Breckinridge was North Carolina and Georgia versus places like Pennsylvania, which have more than double, almost triple, and New York and have triple the population at the time voting for Lincoln. But Douglas will get the second most votes overall, but he will have very, very few actual electoral votes because of the way that our system works. So Lincoln gets the most votes, but doesn't get a majority of the popular vote. Breckinridge gets the second most electoral votes, but only the third most popular vote. Bell gets the third most electoral votes, but the lowest votes total. And Douglas gets the lowest amount of electoral votes, but the second most votes. Because again, our system is not designed to be entirely democratic. It's a little bit messed up. But Lincoln gets more than half the electoral votes, which means he is going to be president. And so you have from November until March when he will become president, and the Union is going to fall apart in the meantime, while Buchanan sits back and does nothing. So this is our last term, secession. Lincoln's election, of course, outrages the Southern states who believe that he's going to outlaw slavery. And so they decide that they're going to break away. Less than a month after the election, the first state to break away is South Carolina. They will secede from the Union on December 20th, 1860. They publish this, the Union is dissolved. Like, we are done, we are breaking away. And the cotton states of Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, and Texas will follow suit in January and February of 1861. And then the start of the war will happen in April, and then Arkansas, Virginia, and North Carolina will secede after that. And again, even though some people might argue that this is about, still might argue even to this day, that this war was about states' rights, nearly all of the secession documents mention slavery. South Carolina, Mississippi, Texas, Alabama, Virginia, and Georgia mention slavery. That South Carolina says we are leaving to preserve the noble institution of slavery. The future vice president says that the cornerstone of the Confederacy is slavery, and that God has decided it to be such. And Georgia, I believe it's other ones mention the plight of slaveholding states at the hands of Northern abolitionists. Again, how these people who don't want slavery are going to force them to give up to give up their slaves is another reason mentioned. And again, Buchanan sits back and does nothing as the country falls apart. So that's it. The Union is dissolved. We are now two separate countries divided based on location, but also some, very different economies, which are based on slavery and the production of cotton, low population versus high population, industrial versus agricultural. And next week, we will talk about everything that comes to pass because of it. And once the Civil War is over, Reconstruction and how we absolutely failed the 4 million slaves that were freed after the end of the war. And that will be the end of History 1301 after next week. So we're almost to the end already. Time flies.